I find it difficult to talk to older generations just because either I'm written off as a dumb kid or I am just completely attacked for my point of view because it's different than theirs.
I think it's okay for our generations to see things differently.
At the end of the day, we can all disagree on what the issues are, but we need to have that mutual respect and kindness for each other to agree to disagree.
I think this is important because we have to know how to work together as a society. When we can't work together, things break down.
Ultimately, we're all Americans, we're all humans. We all have to come together, and in doing so, we have to understand that there might be differences, and those differences are usually to be celebrated.
I think that just being open to listening is the most important thing, and realizing that everyone's opinion is different and it's valid.
Ultimately, all of these issues that we're seeing, regardless of whether you're a millennial or not, Jesus is calling on us to, reach across the aisle, reach out of our comfort zone and get out of our bubble. I think we all just need to be kind to each other and really do a better job of listening and finding common ground.
I think that just relationships with people are what are gonna change this world. Having open conversations and having conversations where you're willing to listen to the other person.
You can either learn by living or you can learn by listening.
Listen.
Listen.
Listen. Listen.
Listening.
Listen.
Listen.
We kick off a sermon series today around listening. We're going to listen in this series to the voices of our younger generations, Millennials and Gen Z, and we're listening to them not because they are the future, but because they are the present. They, Millennials and Gen Z, they are the two largest generations in America today, and we're going to listen to this group as they ask questions about the really big issues, the things that they're concerned about in our world today. We're going to listen, and then we're going to together ask the question, what would Jesus say about these concerns? And each week we're going to discuss how we can, across generations, work together to address these big, critical issues. Several months ago, I received a text from Tom about this message that I'm going to give right now. And good luck, says Tom. Lord have mercy upon Mark. It's encouraging, isn't it? I'm a little nervous about starting this series today, but I'm mostly excited. I love and I live to bring people together and to gently challenge them to follow Christ, maybe for the first time or maybe more faithfully. I believe that God has given me a unique skill for listening, and I'm living into my calling and my purpose today by addressing the divisions that are present in our country. I want to invite you to listen with me for what God might say to you through this message today. We're basing this series off content from Church of the Resurrection in Leawood, Kansas, the largest United Methodist church in the United States. When they introduced the promo for this series, someone in their congregation leaned over to his wife and was overheard saying, well, we're not going to be here to listen to any of that nonsense. Whoa. I mentioned that story because if you think that listening to the voices of Millennials and Gen Z is nonsense, and you don't care to hear those voices, well, if you're in business, you're going to be out of business in 30 years. If you think listening to the voices of Millennials and Gen Z is nonsense, well, you're going to have a terrible relationship with your kids and with your grandchildren. If you think listening to these voices is nonsense and you care about the church, your church, or this one or another church, then it has no future if you're not listening to the voices of Millennials and Gen Z. So in this series, we're going to listen. We're going to listen together. A Church of the Resurrection surveyed over 500 Millennials and Gen Zs by giving them a list of the topics that regularly show up as top concerns for those generations. They asked which of these are most urgent to you. And the top 4 that these generations chose are the 4 topics that we're going to address in this series. And we're doing our own survey as well across all generations here at Sycamore Creek, and you'll see the link on the screen. If you haven't taken that survey, I encourage you to do so. We're using our survey to look at generational differences. And in light of the survey results, each week we're going to ask the question, what would Jesus say about these things? We'll ask, what can we do then in response to what Jesus says? Now here's the thing, different generations have been shaped by different experiences. So I'm going to begin today by highlighting differences between generations. And So when we talk about generations, we know what I'm talking about. There are huge differences between different generations today. The graph that you'll see on the screen was produced in 2019 by the Pew Research Center. So note that's 2019, it was 2 years ago. So add 2 years to each of the ages listed on the screen. And on the left side of this graph is the greatest generation. Now, these are people who are born before 1928, and some of these folks are still alive. That includes my 96-year-old grandfather, who's part of this generation. We live for the first time in history with 6 generations alive at the same time. Now, there have occasionally been some individuals from 6 generations, but today we have a large populace of 6 different generations. The next generation you'll see on the screen is the silent generation, born between 1928 and 1945. The things that shaped this generation are the Great Depression and World War II. Those two life experiences as children growing up during the Depression, and some of them who came of age and went off to fight at the end of World War II, where they lost parents or siblings in the war. Those two things had a profound impact on their lives, and generally this generation, they're very frugal and they're very responsible. Now we come to 1946 through 1964, and the next generation was when 2 million GIs came back from the war and they started having babies. This generation is the baby boom generation, the boomers, right? Ages 57 to 75. And this generation, the boomers, they experienced huge major cultural shifts. Elvis and rock and roll were part of that culture shift. The Cold War was huge for this generation. And well, they grew up in fear of an atomic bomb with exercises in school to hide under their desks in case of a bombing, as if that would help. This generation experienced a major shifts and concerns for civil rights for everyone. Starting in the 1950s, the civil rights movement became something that shaped this generation. And well, that continued with Dr. King and into the 1960s. This generation was the invention of the birth control pill, which fundamentally shaped how women and families planned for having children. But it was also part of mobilizing women into the workplace. Suddenly, there were kids raised in homes with both mom and dad who were out of the home working. And that gives rise to the next generation, my generation, the Gen Xers, Generation X, born from 1965 to 1980. I was born at the very end of this generation in 1978, so I'm special. I'm a baby Gen Xer. This generation is also known as the latchkey kids because their mom and dads were often both at work. This generation was impacted by the boomer generation deciding, you know what, we're not going to stay in a marriage if we're not happy anymore. And there's a huge rise in divorces that impacted Gen X kids growing up. For Gen X kids, their parents were likely either divorced or they were both working, hence latchkey kids. This is the first generation to really get their hands on computers, and there were lots of things that were happening for this generation, like the Sony Walkman and the rise of video games. This generation was originally known as slackers. You remember that term? But it ends up, they're really hard workers. They care about a work-life balance because they watch their parents work like crazy to get ahead, and this generation recognized that they paid the price for that at times. And that brings us to the generations that we want to focus on today, the millennials, born between 1981 and 1996, and those born after 1997, Generation Z. Let's take a look at those generations. The generation that grew up with these in their homes, they are millennials. There were computers in everyone's house. That's a Macintosh from 1984, and computers shaped this generation. But so did this pivotal event in 2001. They watched the towers fall in their classrooms in school. They watched the aftermath and the reality of terrorist attacks settled in. This generation has experienced a level of connection to the world through the internet that has never been seen before. They had the capacity to have relationships with different people around the globe who spoke different languages and had different cultures. It's a mind-blowing thing that I don't think we still fully understand. Now, one of the Gen Xers gave this generation the gift of Facebook, which is part of the creation of social media. Again, I think social media is something we don't really fully understand or comprehend the impact that social media has on how we do life and how we think and how we get our news and how we have relationships. These are the millennials, and then after them we have the Gen Zs, born after 1997. And there are some very unique things about this generation, Gen Z. Now, let me show you this on the left side of the screen. You'll see that there's a graph, and 18% of boomers were from a racial or ethnic minority. 30% of Gen Xers, 39% of millennials, and now 48% of Gen Z are from a racial or ethnic minority. This, of course, is unprecedented in American history. When Europeans first came to the United States, they were the minority, but since that time, with the founding of the United States, most people in the United States have been white. And our culture has been dominated by people who are both white and what they like and prefer. For Gen Z, their friends, their family members, likely their spouses, they're going to be people of color. This generation experiences the world differently. In addition to that, if you look on the right side of the screen, you'll see that post-millennials or Gen Z will be the most educated of any generation in history. More Gen Z than any generation before them are going to go to college. These are the people who are going to be your doctors and your lawyers and school teachers and pastors. And they're going to be the people that you turn to for advice. In the US today, 40% of Americans work for somebody who's younger than themselves. If you're still working, well, the odds are you're going to be working for someone who's younger than you. Now, Gen Z is the first generation to grow up with a president who looked like this. 2 generations before, people were fighting to not give up their seat on a bus. And then in 2008, President Obama became the first person of color to be president of the United States. This generation is the first to grow up with devices that they can touch with touch screens. And my kids are Gen Z. And well, if my parents have trouble with their iPad or their phone, they have my kids fix it or explain it for them. My kids are digital natives. They're immersed in technology. This generation doesn't send letters. They don't even send email. This is old school. They text, right? They don't even text with words or sentences, but with emojis. Gen Z is breaking the mold in many ways, and along with the millennials, they're deeply concerned about social justice and inclusion. Inclusion is a huge deal for millennials and Gen Z. We'll discuss that more later in this series. Now, these generations haven't grown up ducking under desks because they're afraid of an atom bomb. They've learned to duck under their desks because there might be a threat of an active shooter in their school. So here's a chat question for you as you think about generations. What generation are you a part of? And what things do you think have shaped you and your generation? Let's discuss that.